A Marxist utopia, a socialist utopia, is about everyone mattering, everyone being of the same value. Because society produces, and society is the set of social relations. And even if somebody is not healthy enough to work, that person has a right upon society to earn. So everybody earns the same thing, to each according to his need, from each according to his ability. That's not an allegorical statement. That's a real statement based in real facts, that it is society. When I go to work, I am working because of what has been input into me. And I'm simply mediating what's being input into me. And I'm social labor. So society produces and society earns. The wage is a social wage. All of these very basic notions from Marx, they've gone missing from the storyline.
All right. Well, welcome back, friends and comrades. Daniel Tudd here with Emancipations podcast. And I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Ali Kadri, as well as Benji Schoendorff. And thanks, many thanks to Benji, who's the host of Resistance is Fertile, an excellent podcast on anti-imperialist topics and issues on today's left. So Benji, first of all, let me welcome you and ask how you're doing today. Then we'll move to introduce Professor Kadri.
Thanks very much, Daniel. I'm really happy that we can have this conversation, the three of us. Our podcast is on Substack, by the way, and I'm doing as well as I can, given some personal circumstances. So I hope I will still be able to be present to this conversation that I've been so looking forward to.
Yes, I just wanted to thank you again, Benji, for introducing me to Professor Kadri's work. So listen, comrades, this is a very special opportunity to learn from a scholar of Marxism, Ali Kadri, who's been working for many decades now. And I was frankly very quite moved in reading The Accumulation of Waste, the 2023 book that came out. And we're going to be speaking about this work, but I think we'll also touch upon Professor Kadri's theoretical output more generally. He's the author of multiple books, including such titles as East Asia and the Arab World, Imperialism with reference to Syria and the Unmaking of Arab Socialism. He is a professor at Sun Yat-sen University. And one of the things, Professor Kadri, that strikes me in reading your work is the very particular attention that you give to anti-imperialism in your understanding of Marxism. Obviously, you're building off of a whole range of Marxist thinkers, and we do want to talk about your background, your education, some of your influences in Marxist theory. I'm very struck by the fact that you pull from Lenin, you pull from Ho Chi Minh, you pull from Mao, you pull from Louis Althusser, from Esteban Mesaros, from Lukács, from Domenico Losurdo, and of course from Marx and Engels. And at the same time, you have a critique of Western Marxism. And this is where I want to begin with your understanding of Western Marxism. Just as background, Professor Kadri, my podcast, Emancipations, has sought to put into debate and discussion in the American Marxist milieu, but really we could say the Western Marxist milieu, this contentious category of quote-unquote Western Marxism. And you seem to have a very, I would say, precise understanding of its dynamics, of its shortcomings, perhaps maybe even some of its strengths, because I will just remind comrades that even in Losurdo's recently translated book, Western Marxism, he does recognize some contributions of Western Marxist thinkers, but from the standpoint of revolutionary practice, he's going to present an extremely robust critique, as do you. Could we begin with a sort of conception of Western Marxism as you see it? How long have you seen Western Marxism as a symptom or as a problem?
Yeah. I like everyone. It's like, life is a learning by doing so process, and one grows into the traditions of the philosophical schools of Western Marxism, and and but as always, one enters into science with the naivety. One enters into learning with the naivete of a scientist, but then develops a critique. And so there was the learning process involved some naivete and as well as some critique. The critique arose because of the position that many Marxists have adopted vis-à-vis the aggression of America and Europe against the developing world. Complicit, that's the first, how is thought translated into practice? Because one sees an elaborate system of thinking, an eloquent system of thinking in many of the theories. But at the same time, thought is inseparable from reality. Consciousness is determined by the material circumstances. And even the fictional is materially rooted. The ideal is materially rooted. And in that sense, it sort of my thoughts developed to see that thought was also class confined and regionally confined as well in some respects, but more class confined than regionally confined, because one sees people in the Western Hemisphere not adopting the line of complicity. Let us attack Libya. Let's attack Venezuela. Let's attack Cuba, Iraq. The list is long because these are fascist, and although we are imperialist, imperialism is still better than fascism, or some sort of hollow logic as such. So I always suspected something, and when you root thought in its class basis, you find that these were not the beauty of the language and the appeal to a utopia of sort, a socialist utopia of sorts, concealed beneath it the schism and the gap that exists between the South and the North. And the idea was to, and so it is because of that chasm between that's also reflected in thought, that I come to see that Marxism is not all of the same color. Its logic is the same, but logic is impertinent without a referent in reality. And some of that logic was the sort of logic that says that it is okay to aggress Vietnam because Vietnam is just as authoritarian as Cuba or something of the sort. So it's okay for the United States to aggress Vietnam and so on. So all of this coming from, also myself, I come from the developing world, and probably my own exposure to Marxist thought is not the same exposure as well. It's not the same exposure as Marxism was a way to basically establish the sovereignty of the masses, the sovereignty of they represent a state that is consolidated by the power of the masses, and so on. So all of these things. So the issue of imperialism is always featured centrally in all, because like in a sense, there are some weak states where the anecdote has it that they can go to the bathroom in some comprador leaders without phoning the American embassy. It's funny that I had a student. I was supervising a student who once who became a journalist. I mean, he was doing a journalist job on the side and he wrote an article in some country, and he wrote an article criticizing the United States policies or something like that. And he told me that, the next day he was called to the embassy and ostracized for writing something. So these are actual life circumstances that necessarily make you see things differently and make you see the struggle as a struggle for existence in the literal sense. Uh, what do we mean? Because literally, the more sovereign, the more we are in control of our resources, human and natural resources, and the more we deploy of those resources for our own benefit, rather than the usurpation of resources, the usurpation of the minds, of the labor, of the natural resources, and the destruction of the more we redeploy these through with our labor in the developing nations, the more we better our lives, and if we better our lives, we exist longer. We literally live longer, and these sort of obvious things that the blinders of ideology and the Eurocentrism, the fact that not only Eurocentrism is an over trumped term, but in fact, the idea that remains that it is the social circumstances that are going to, and that's the basis of historical materialism. When we see things as the real material social circumstances, they are going to define the mode of thought, and they're going to define the mode of thought in relation to how a class acts. And the class is not simply a status or an income or something like that. A class is an ontological thing. It's a thing out there that is not necessarily essentialist or primordial or anything like that. It is determined by the historical phase, by the historical period. The laws of existence under capitalism necessitate the economizing the life of labor and so on. So we're going to live shorter life. So the struggle becomes literally not a struggle of the alienated worker who's working on an assembly line, and he's drained by the glitch and or the grids of Hollywood, like the escapism into alcohol, into drugs, and so on. It is rather the making sure that we put 2 meals rather than 1 meal a day and 3 meals a day, and we have some basic antibiotics and things like that, because as we and the issue is, it's always struck me that there is always a structural genocide. Whenever I read reports from the World Food Program, it basically, it's flabbergasting. It's shocking that to see that so many thousands and thousands, millions die unnecessarily as a result of hunger. And when and the picture is that the food is not relatively overproduced relative to the market, as I said. It is absolutely overproduced in all its elements. And I worked on a paper once in Rome. I stayed in Rome, and I worked on a paper on how to because there was some sort of international effort to eliminate hunger, and I was I was accessing some data on these issues. I don't do that anymore because but I was accessing some data on how many countries in the world have acute dependence on food imports from the Western Hemisphere, and acute dependence on the Western Hemisphere uh, uh, for borrowing money and simply to feed people. And I always thought that when if we go back not long ago, some 17, 18 years ago, during the Great Recession, Ben Bernanke he lowered the interest rate to kickstart the economy, and then we had hunger in some places in the world, and yet some people, when some Federal Reservists who are of minute intellect and they they reflect a culture of great hate behind the mechanics and the technocracy of the language that they use. It is a language of hate. It is if we investigate this language, it's just a saying that the other race is terrible. It's okay if it dies because they can't produce anything. And so Ben Bernanke and his fellows push a button that lowers the interest rate. And many countries around the world who are food dependent, acutely food dependent, they become hungry. And yet, despite that universality of this liquid world, as one person called it, despite that, in which everything is interacting and interrelated and reinforcing. Despite that, this is a fact. This is not appealing to the emotions of anybody. You see people saying there isn't an imperialism. Imperialism is what is imperialism other than the fact that you can actually clobber the working classes, the underlings in the center too, the minorities and the disenfranchised in the center, who are not in the leading link of the social formation of the North, and much of the globe with a push button that says, I want to reduce the interest rate to kickstart the economy. And because we are operating below potential, that lowering of the interest rate will not have an impact on inflation. So the Phillips curve is not working here. You model it and you speak it in a language that is technical, but the technical language is in fact an alibi of the social murder, a prelude to the social murder. And if you can, and if we think about the world altogether as a single unit of production, because values is related to class, and class is not related to any nationality or identity, because the real identity, the way of existence is class, because I make things in relating to myself, in my relation to nature, I am subject, nature is object, and so on. And I have relations with other. I socially reproduce through that. So I need to, to live better, to eat and drink, and be jolly, whatever. And so you see, and in that sort of world, all of this is a phenomena that is before us, and yet it is overlooked as if the world is not a single unit of production. I always remember in systems science, they say in the 1500s or some, the long 16th century, the world was many economies that became a single economy. So it's been a single economy since then. I mean, imagine now with the fact that financialization and the level of abstraction that is incurred, you can push a button and starve people abroad. And the issue becomes even more severe because if so many people abroad are going to depend on the rents that the United States produce to survive from moment to the next, and the rents that the United States, grabs, not produce, grabs, are related to the level of immiserization and structural genocide that the Third World, so all the contradictions built up. I mean, I need to destroy them to grab more of their rents. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to give them some dollars. I'm going to print some dollars. But I'm printing some dollars because money is a social convention. If I have power, I can print money indefinitely because it's a symbol and powers make symbols. So I can make these people starve. And actually, I am making profits because I am starving people. And all of this, that's the historical causality. It's when you need to arrest the development of the productive forces in the South in order to better the productive forces in the North. So the cause of better technology in the North is not how smart people in the North are, it's how vicious they are against the developing world. And all of this real picture, very real picture, the way things exist. It's the phenomena before us. And if it could be told like a story, I'm telling it like a story. That is missing from the vocabulary, from the storyline of many Marxists in the West. And that is not, and it shows that, and the point is, it shouldn't be missing because a Marxist utopia, a socialist utopia, is about everyone mattering, everyone being of the same value. Because society produces, and society is the set of social relations. And even if somebody is not healthy enough to work, that person has a right upon society to earn. So everybody earns the same thing, to each according to his need, from each according to his ability. That's not an allegorical statement. That's a real statement based in real facts, that it is society. When I go to work, I am working because of what has been input into me. And I'm simply mediating what's being input into me. And I'm social labor. So society produces and society earns. The wage is a social wage. All of these very basic notions from Marx, they've gone missing from the storyline. And so knowing this, and one has to bring the picture back, put the picture back up. And then if phenomena makes us question the way we conceptualize things in the past, and time is qualitative, that things have every concept that we've read in the past, that we've talked in the past with, is no longer referencing reality as it and the dynamics of the reality as it is now, then we must rethink the concepts. And we must rethink the ideological impact, because when we say value and value theory and something of value, we are imprinting in the minds of people that this is something good, that is something worthwhile. Well, the value relations in Marx is not that at all. It's because things get a price that equals that value. And the value relation is when you free the value relation, that means you free the ability of capital to basically destroy life, all social life, man and nature. And so we must rethink the story of value, the theory of value, and we must rethink the renaming of things in light of the new phenomena that is definitively telling us that labor hasn't availed. Labor hasn't won. We have not won, because if we win, then the planet would not be a minute or two to midnight. It's too obvious, isn't it? I mean, and yet This is what needs to be highlighted. This is what needs to be the phenomena is, if I'm going to read why are things happening on a global scale, on a universal scale, not a particular condition. If I'm going to read theory, and the theory of transition, then I must read into how did we transition into where we are today. And then we must question the laws of transition, because theory is about the laws of transition. We question these laws of transition, and we say to ourselves, look, something is going wrong. And where Lizardo counts very much is in the fact that he's saying, I have a roadmap to revitalize Western Marxism, to basically let them think, of how things have availed so far. We haven't done well. We shouldn't be complicit with imperialism at all, not an iota. And so on and so forth. That's really the case.
Much. Thank you so much, Professor Kadri, for this overview. I think you're absolutely refreshing to read and to listen to, because you have this fluency with what you said is the basic Marxist categories. And Western Marxism, I think since the 70s, in my view, has engaged in similar, you could say, almost make it as a sort of historical analog to the Second International, where you had a lot of theoretical revisionism. And I admire your work, because it feels as if you are speaking the language of Marx's Capital in a pure way, in an unadulterated way. Your position is, no, we don't need all of these fancy theories to account for financialization or for financial capitalism, or even of neoliberalism, So in a sense, that draws me to my next question. And this revolves around a very important idea that you introduce in your book about class cannibalism. And I wanted to invite you to say something about this idea, because one of the questions that your work really brings out, and Benji, I want to hear your thoughts after this, if we might, is a debate that we've seen a lot about within Western Marxism, but beyond, and really, I mean, frankly, probably stretching back even to Marx and Engels' own time. And that is the question of the possibility of a revolutionary agency of the working class in the core, what world systems theory would call the core regions, or what you call the Western regions. And one of the dynamics that super exploitation does, both in the developing world, but also in the core regions, is it fragments the possible unity. Anyway, I mean, we see this with Lenin in his own theory of trade unionism and so on. The possible unity of labor to have a true confrontation with capital, right? Where there would be a kind of confrontation, a dialectic that would take place. And it seems as if that dialectic is stalled in our time. But this is long standing. I mean, even in the Critique of Dialectical Reason, Jean-Paul Sartre put forward something like the failure of dialectical materialism to get at revolutionary agency. We see this with Fanon as well. So I know this is a big question, but my question is about where are we at today in regards to revolutionary agency and class? How might we begin to map this and think this? It's a long-standing question, but maybe you might reflect on this.
This is things have become more difficult to basically get revolutionary consciousness going and to remold theory into practice. Put revolutionary theory into practice. Things have become much more difficult than they were before. I'll speak first about the conditions in the developing world, in many indebted countries in the developing world. And I'll give a very simple example that we all probably know. For instance, in the case of Ghana, when Kufuor was president, and he was going to hold elections, and he was going to hold elections, and he was indebted. He was indebted, and they didn't like his stance on privatization. They wanted to privatize some mines and some other things, and he did not go along with what they wanted. But of course, he depended every short while on an infusion of dollars, because countries have structural trade deficits, so they need dollars to service their debt. So the very agency that lends the dollars to the developing world also every now and then disburses a small amount to resurface the debt that this country owes. Otherwise, because they can't service the debt, then the currency falls relative to to the dollar, and the dollar is world trade currency. Then things become more difficult to buy, and the price of everything at home rises. People rise when the price rises. People, start, and so if a guy wants to, win an election, and he doesn't have, if there are elections, then he will have to basically say, look, I'll privatize, I'll do whatever you want, or something like that. In some other cases, this is one real case. In some other cases, there has been a chronic dependency on these disbursements. If they are delayed even for a very short while, and the financial market works in a very, at a very high frequency, then the national currency falls, and the inflation rises, and because they don't produce much, since their technology has been debilitated on purpose through a history of encroachment and war and so on, and treaties that disembowel the capacity of the nation to rise on its own. What you have is a situation where the population becomes dependent on that rent, that disbursement that comes to service the dollar debt. And know that they cannot fight, because most of these countries are food deficient. They lack the basic sustenance production. And so the population develops a sort of adaptation mechanism to the fact, let's play along, because we cannot, if we go wrong, and so on. And of course, there's an absence of revolutionary politics in those countries. And the absence of revolutionary politics, and that's a crucial point, is pretty much as a result of socialist ideological defeat ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union, and also because Western Marxism has created the mirage that it is possible through social, democratic, and electoral activities to arrive at some working arrangement that banishes the comprador, which is the comprador is of the same class fabric as the United States and other settler colonial states like Israel, and they will massacre the population. And we know they do massacre their own populations. Not their own population, the working classes globally, but let's say, for the sake of speak, their own populations, and we've seen many of those. And so now we have a situation where many of the working classes are dependent on these rents, and they know they are dependent, they know we are in debt, And they believe that the debt is a monolithic. It's like a monolith of sort. The fiction becomes a reality because of the power, the aura of the United States, which basically derives from the fact that it can actually move into any country and destroy the hell out of it. If it doesn't do that, because it doesn't need to do that, but it literally will do that in case it does. So what you have is that dependency on these things. But here is the issue. Here is the issue. This working class is going to live a lesser life literally, as a result of its compromise with with capital, the intensified capital, which is the imperialist relation, which is a relation that says capital can only resolve its contradiction between production and relations to production by destroying the population, but literally economizing the lives of the population. So, in that context, the trade-off becomes me and my children are going to live lesser and lesser lives, more miserable lives, unless we rid ourselves of that dependency. And so the potential is there. The potential is really a real potential. It's not like it's about, as I said, one meal or two meals and so on. Meals change, whatever it takes to sustain a life under modern conditions. Now, that's not the same in the North. The North lives off the rents. The rents, how do the rents accumulate? The destruction of resources and of the productive forces in the South lets all the resources, all the value is going to be transferred to the North, including the value that's going to build knowledge, that's going to build the machines, and science is going to progress objectively anyways. So that when science translates into technology and technology serves as means of power and coercion, then it will develop into a ratcheting up of the forces of imperialism and the capacity I can destroy you, therefore be quiet and be destroyed over a longer period of time, or else you will, so you can either enjoy a structural genocide or I'm going to inflict upon you a real direct genocide. And this is not like a question of choice. It is a historical imperative. Why is it a historical imperative? It doesn't occur now. I'm not predicting. I am just saying, if you look at the history of imperialism, of colonialism, imperialism, you will see that it is a history, in one estimate, colonial wars have resulted between 1500 and 1900 in some 400 or 500 million people. That's when the population of the earth was less than 1 billion. So we're looking at huge numbers of the destruction, So the destruction is the phenomena, it's the rule, and the exception is, it's not like prepare for war if you want peace. It is prepare for war because you want war, because war is the mandate of history. And so you have, but capital is not only a social relation in the abstract. Capital has an army, it has people, and capitalists are, and the labor, which is a form of capital in the structural North, is in the structural North, which is a class structure, not the North geographically or ethnically or anything like that. It is definitively a question, and the class is, as I defined it, rather, I'm not going to use the term ontological loosely, but let's say I'm going to use it loosely here, as an ontological condition of sorts, a condition of being, rather than, before knowing and so on. So capital is not an abstract relationship without an address. And the unequal development and unequal exchange is not related to the fact that my machines are better, therefore I am better. It is related to the fact that I am more powerful, therefore my machines are better. And I am more powerful because I can exact so much death and destruction on the South to hinder their unless, of course, one nation becomes sovereign and develops its productive forces, starts feeding its population. And we have many socialist experiments of the sort. Real experiments where life expectancy rose, where people had jobs and had job security. That has occurred. We need that for all the planet, right? And it goes without saying that we need that for all the planet. I don't want to sound like I'm professing anything, but this is the obvious reflexive way of putting things in. So, but capital has an army, and capital is resilient. And the army of capital, the people that are forms of capital, the labor that is a form of capital is capital. And it thinks like capital, and capital thinks like a thing. It embodies, it assimilates the market and the commodity. That's commodity fetishism is not about, the commodity is beautiful and I'm mesmerized by the consumer. Commodity fetishism means the commodity runs my life, the market runs my life. I live or don't live by the tune of the market. And that capital knows that, and it's resilient. It knows that it needs to destroy. It knows that I need to stabilize. And Hariri Emmanuel had said, I'm going to be disdained. I'm going to be exiled from academia because I'm thinking in those terms. I'm thinking that the power that's behind the income inequality is the historical cause and not the machines. He did not reify, he did not say, I'm going to make a thing into a subject. There are people who are thingified, they've become things and they are subject. So you have, if you like to take it into another level, a collapse of substance and subject or something like that. You can twist and turn and find something. But the point is that this class of people, the thinkified people, the people who are things, who don't feel anymore, who don't have the ethics, that is why we have a televised genocide without really an effective mechanism. It's not the first televised genocide. There is the Rwandan genocide before it as well. And if that other genocide was played out in real time over months. Well, this one is over more than 2 years now. But you see, so the world has experienced too many genocides without an effective measure to arrest the genocides because there are things which are dominating the development of history. And these things are real. They're people who are things. And when you think that the death of people and the death of nature in terms of production is when you think of the death of people and the death of social nature, that's the death of nature, social nature together. When you think that this is a commodity, in war is a thing because somebody funded the war with a treasury bill, and he's going to get rents on it. So much, and so there are rents, and the that accrue from a fact that we've hired a poor person. The other day I've heard somebody say from the United States Army. He says, I was poor and the United States Army provided me with socialism. They provided me with a job and health and security to go kill other poor people. So so you have a waged worker who is going to destroy massive firepower. I mean, beyond the pale, the way that we've developed firepower. We're going to destroy other people. So the death of other people, the death of their name, the destruction that has been, specifically the death of people, particularly death of people, because living labor becoming dead labor is the big story that is going to become the furnace of surplus value creation and the furnace of profit for capital. So destruction, wasting nature, wasting life is the process, is the basis of the process of accumulation. When you have that story in mind, or you have this process in mind, then what you have is death, the commodity that is fetishized, that is the fetish that runs life. So death runs life. And when we think about how much death there has been to the planet and to people, relative to whatever good things we've accumulated, we find that there is a lot more premature death of social nature than anything else, such that we are at a point where we are going to collapse or something like this. We are going to croak at one point or another, as everybody says. I'll explain how this happens, but another probably video or something. But death commands life. And we know that death commands life because we have a lot of death. Death has been sort of multiplied and filled the earth, so to speak. You can take it from in a biblical sense, let death multiply and fill the earth. And yet nobody sees that because of the blinkers and the blinders of ideological and the capacity of ideology. And the real victory of capital is this ideological control. And this ideological control, as I think, does not come from the beauty of language nor the eloquence of the psychoanalytic Marxist, whatever things that are spun. But it comes from the fact that people are beaten into submission and they accept any ideas that capital puts forth in order to survive a little longer under the circumstances. Where their blood, the more of their blood is spilt, the more of the profits are derived. That's the logic of that. In social reproduction term, we no longer think of a guy who went to a factory and worked for 8 hours, and that's time irrelevant. That's time independent. There is no history here. It's just like a neoclassical theory, where a guy is not a guy. A guy in Marx is social man, and social man is society. He goes to the factory. That means all of society went to the factory. All of society earned a wage. All of society earned a wage to keep itself from starving. And if it's going to fight for higher wages, it has to unify and make whatever identity serve the class interest. Subdue identity to class, as what's her name? Boggs. Lee Boggs, remember her? Yeah, she was fantastic on that point. Yes, I always remember her. She left quite an yes. So it's pretty much one saying the obvious rather, but the obvious is unfortunately missing in the scheme of things, and so there is a potential in the south and in parts of the north. But capital knows that, I can have a New Deal, I can have another Keynesianism. The printing of money is irrelevant for capital. A wage policy is irrelevant, yes.
One thing I find really interesting in your analysis, and I see it as a kind of continuation of Marx's analysis, where it was more going, you're not getting the real value from your work. This is taken out of you, you're being exploited, this is turned into a commodity. And once you take this analysis forward in Marx's own terms and look at the world system and you go, okay, at the world level, we have to remember that this is a social relation. It's a social relation that is not just established, but maintained by ongoing violence, that exploitation, that turning of, labor value into this dead commodity that eventually comes to be wasted. And what shines through in your work is really how the logic, I call it the death logic of capitalism, imperialist capitalism, is actually unfolding in the world, and it literally needs to kill people, but it also needs to kill social natures, different ways of being in the world, different ontologies. And that is, what your analysis brings to the party, and it kind of washes away all the attempts of Western Marxism you mentioned earlier, which is new ways of interpreting the world, where, and I think it's no accident that you come from the global south. People, in the global majority, they need to change it because they're on the receiving end of the system. And so you always need to keep in mind the 11th thesis on Feuerbach. It's not just, the point is not just to interpret this, is to change it. And so you have that immediacy. And one thing, you wrote your book, it came out just before the Al-Aqsa flood. And I think the metaphor is amazingly brilliant, because what a flood does is it washes everything that's kind of on the surface and reveals what was underneath, the underlying structure. And this is what we're seeing in the underlying structure of this system, is it literally means to kill all of us. And, as you say, it's a thing that thinks. And that's, the way you talk about the fetishism of commodity is very enlightening. It's not, we ascribe these magical powers. No, it's not that. It's really, social relations have turned into commodity relations, and commodity relations into social relations. And now they govern our life. And they literally need to waste us and to waste social nature. And I think this is what the flood is showing us. We are seeing now in Gaza and all around Western Asia unbelievable levels of destruction that on the surface make no sense. People are reaching out going, oh, maybe it's the book of Joshua being used as a field manual for TikTok genocide. But it's not. It's literally, showing to us in 4K live stream the logic of the system. And I personally see it as optimistic, is maybe not the word, but because we see now that it is a struggle between this unthinking death machine and basically life in all its forms, it actually gives us the basis, I believe, to build much broader alliances. And this is also what I get out of your book.
Yes. No. That's for that last point is actually captured. It says it very eloquently. All life forms are, and it is. I mean, when I mean the focus of the book is that there is a waste of life always. A waste of life is the basis of accumulation, and so waste is not trash. Waste is wasting life, and wasting, you waste nature in order to waste life as well. So you invest in the destruction of nature. It becomes a commodity, and that commodity becomes a machine, and that machine produces death, and it expands commodification. It shortens life, and it makes life more expensive for society in a shorter time. So you commodify and monetize many more things. So you increase the scope of the moneyed economy, and you decrease the social cost of reproduction of labor, such that with more money you're getting more as a result of more death, and it's all very exponential. Because the profit rate is when you think of the profit rate, the rate is positive. That means the level of it is exponential. So you have to kill more and more at exponential rates in order, always relative to the historical period, because time is qualitative. You can't say I'm living to a 50 now, like the racists say, the sand nigger lives to 50 now, he lived to 20 1,000 years ago. Look how good capitalism has been to him. If you think about how destructive capitalism has been to the developing world, and the death to the developing world, it is astonishing. It's so whenever a society develops a sovereignty of the masses, a popular sovereignty, then we see things. We see a retention of wealth, a retention of resources. People don't go dying in the boats as cheap labor to work at the restaurants of Italy. They'll work at home, but they'll have enough food and security and job at home and things like that. All of these things, which is the obvious thing, right? But the point is, genocide, whether structural or direct, is not unsurprising. It should be there. If it's not there now, the prospects of it becoming even more deadly in the future is, judging by the one cannot prediction, of course, is not, and the uncertainty of history, prediction is foolish. But we have a law which necessarily, but not exclusively over time, tells us, look, there are more people who are going to die all the time, more and more people relative to the times. And so if we project that onto the future, that the future is pretty gloomy. Because and these laws are objective and they run our lives. You know, they are the gods, the commodities. The death is God. So I finished this in 2022, and of course published in 2023 or something, and then the genocide occurred, and I'm sure that if labor does not take hold of the range of history, another genocide is going, and more of the structural genocide is going to occur. More people are going to suffer from lack of health if they are in the lower echelons of society, whether in the north or the south. Lack of schooling, lack of so on, living in polluted water, drinking polluted waters, and breathing polluted air, and all of these things. That's the prospect, because that itself is the furnace of surplus value. That's the gas pedestal, the accelerator of the rate of exploitation of the surplus value, because the rate of exploitation is the rate at which society immiserized, how much of society's life is being economized, how much of society life is being compressed. And so it shouldn't come as a surprise. And the same, the Zionist and the Arab comprador and the Europeans and the American ruling classes, financial classes, are of the same social fabric. They are all genocidal, just as genocidal. The Arab masses, for instance, or some African, cannot resort to rebellion because they'll know they'll just be as massacred as much as, sometimes in relation to the fact that we haven't built up an ideological storm yet, a socialist ideological storm, which is going to arise from the weakness of capital to rule, from the difficulties and the changes in the global balance of forces. That is going to sort of infiltrate to the particular. The whole is going to become the determining link and filtrate to the particular, and the agitation of the particular, which is there all the time. The social movements are there all the time, are now going to have an anchor in the universal, in the changing universal conditions to make things better. Because it's the changing universal. If I give money to everybody in a collapsing economy, the money is useless. But if I give money in a rising economy, money is going to be very useful. So the whole is the determining link in the dialectics of the part and the whole. And so what we need to see, it's that the class analysis still holds. The barbarians who are, they have the interface between theory and practice is the condition of the planet. If all the symbols of knowledge that that capital has produced the phenomena that we have before us today, then that theory is not a theory for the masses. That theory is a theory against the masses. The glitz and the appeal of big names and big whatever, what have you, is an appeal, is like a person liking the weapon that's going to slaughter them. That's what actually has been happening. And so, but at the same time, it is very difficult. Of course, how social consciousness, revolutionary consciousness emerges is the most difficult question in social science and in philosophy, because it tells us how do we come to know things better and when do we act on knowing things. And no one has an answer to these things, because we have some universal notions of how things work, but history has plenty of coincidences and necessities working hand in hand, being a facet of this of the same coin, two facets of the same coin. And so we don't have an actual grasp of how revolutionary consciousness will develop. But if we take the fundamental premise that revolutionary consciousness its ideal arises upon the correct practice. And then the correct practice is to basically pinpoint the principal contradiction, which is the capital labor contradiction, becoming the global north, the global south contradiction. If we target the principal contradiction, I think, and there are many ways, but as you said, unfortunately, violence is intrinsic to accumulation. Violence is the pedestal of accumulation. It's where all the value comes from. Actually, if you it comes from not in terms of percentages, but in terms of historical causation. It's the predicate. It's the historical and rational predicate of everything. It's the fact that you can beat up somebody to take everything they have. That's the logic of history, unfortunately. So in that logic, whatever happens is the masses are going to resort to a new people's war. The former people war was a plow and a gun. We no longer have a plow now. No one sees. Not many people know what a plow is, but there is the means of sustenance remain. They're digitalized. They're so on and so forth. So there is, but it is never going to escape revolutionary violence. It's and violence is quite unfortunate, because if it builds in a way that violence gains a momentum on its own, because sometimes, as you know, in theory, we say violence breeds violence, and so that the scary part of the story is that when the thingified when capitalists who are things, who are running the show, might resort to the ultimate forms of violence. And that's what's really scary. I mean, I'm not sure this is a logical proposition, and only a fool follows a logical proposition to its logical end. So I'm being foolish, but it is worthwhile saying that the more mesmerized the capitalists are with the workings of the market and so on, and the more of things they become, such that billionaires run the show in the United States, when half the population is probably living under poverty and many lack basic health care. When you have a situation as such, even in the United States, and when we know that external politics are going to reflect internal politics at an intensified million times or something, then the picture is pretty gloomy logically. One cannot predict what's going to happen, but the logic of things is pretty gloomy. And I don't want to, but the positive thing is that labor is also wise in its commitment to the struggle. I think it will be wise. It will not. It knows. It is confronting. Sun Tzu says, "Know your enemy. Know how your enemy thinks. Know." And the three knows about the enemies. So you will win the battle. So we know the enemy. We know how. And the enemy. I mean, if you think about the culture of the working class, of the ruling classes in the Western Hemisphere, specifically the American ruling class, and the charade and the clownishness, and how clownish they are relative to the disaster that is occurring on a planetary scale. It becomes pretty scary, I think. There is. Sometimes they say so. Democracy is a form of power exercise. So people's democracy is when people exercise democracy, and bourgeois democracy is when the bourgeoisie exercises democracy. There's no such thing as democracy in the abstract, or freedom in the abstract as detached from reality. And nothing is detached from reality because we are all real. Otherwise, we're not materialists. We become, theists of thought, theologians or something like that. Yeah.
So there is the role of China, and the way your analysis also is very enlightening to me, where you go, well, China is actually producing use value. So it's not like accumulating as an imperialist power. It's not beating up other countries around the world. And it's really producing, longer lifespans. It's in China, it's producing use value, and it's also producing use value outside. There's this famous saying, when the Chinese come, we get a university, we get a railroad, we get a hospital, and when the Western guys come, we get a lecture. So there is use value being produced, but at the same time, China needs to be integrated into the world capitalist imperialist system, and be very careful, because you have nuclear powers on both sides. And I think of Sun Tzu a lot, and they need to fight the supreme art of war, which is the war that you win without fighting. So you have this on the one side, in terms of very big, because they have now, the empire has kind of lost economic supremacy, but not, of course, the supremacy of extracting value through violence. It's lost military supremacy. It's lost any moral masks, following the Al-Aqsa flood. And so I'm interested in your view of the articulation of that, kind of sovereign bloc, or however to call it. But clearly China, for me, is a socialist force in the world. And the other side being people's war in the global majorities are still subjected to the full violence of imperialism, the full genocidal violence, where I think you said it is to be the hammer and the plow. No, I think it will be the hammer and the engineering PhD. Like, we see in Gaza, where people are literally, the knowledge has now been, the imperialists don't have anymore that historical accident of the monopoly on cutting edge science and knowledge. And I think this is kind of what is going to give the people of the world the tools and the means and the weapons to fight this thing. But at another level, I don't think like China or Russia can fight an actual shooting war with the empire, because then, as you said, the danger is to blow everything up. And I want to say one last thing, because sometimes, in my reading group about your book, some people find it super gloomy and super depressing. I actually find it clarifying, and I find in this, setting out the clarity of what's going on, there is really the possibility of building a new revolutionary consciousness. Exactly how is probably beyond this conversation, but I tend to get this more out of your work than, oh my God, we're all going to die kind of thing.
Let me just add one quick thing, then we go to Ali. I love this question, Benji, because I liked this section of your book, which I think is entitled China is Not Imperialist, which is very important to state this directly. So I just want to invite you to maybe say something more about this. And then one little thing I could add, if I might. One idea that has percolated in our space that we've developed here is the idea of the development of a new international organization. And I was wanting to gather your thoughts on this from an organizational standpoint. If China cannot necessarily facilitate the adequate revolutionary consciousness amongst these in these zones of acute exploitation in the global south, perhaps a new international could.
Oh, okay, thanks. I'll stick to Benji's first, and then I'll come back to your point, Daniel. And so I used to travel to work in Beirut, every morning, and there were two banners. Somebody put two banners on there, in the middle of the street, and you'd think one is by Garcia Lorca. He quoted Garcia Lorca from the poem when he was in New York, and it says, there are empty spaces that ache, or something like that. I'm translating it, and it's a beautiful verse or something like this. And the other banner, few hundred yards away, it says, "Thank you, China, for the cheap toys to our children because we couldn't afford the Western toys." So in fact, it's not just the toys, it's not just the consumable, it's also the investments in infrastructure, which basically galvanizes and reinvigorates the national economy. And to build capacity for a national economy is a new form of people's war. It's just enabling people to become more productive for them because they have the energy and the resources and so on. So China is actually, in a roundabout way, still contributing to international liberation movements, but under the radar. It's so on. It's not so much under the radar for the Western Hemisphere. They know this, and that's why they target China. They know that they really want to just print money and lend this worthless money to a country and make it starve as a result of that. And the purpose is not to earn the interest on the money. The purpose is to make it starve, because the Western Hemisphere knows about the primacy of politics. Capital knows about the primacy of politics. Starving people is the root cause of the root motor of the rate of exploitation. The higher the rate of exploitation, the higher the starvation rate. Because, as again, it's a single unit of production. The globe is a single unit. The totality of social production, the totality of social relations is the totality of social production. Capital is totalizing, and so on. And so that's in respect to China. As to the depressing part, and there is, it's one has to be really foolish not to take note of the fact that there is that we are all humans, and the planet altogether is suffering naturally and socially. You've got to not really hear the news or be detached or completely wacko, not to basically watch the news for 5 seconds and not to be affected by it. And not only now, at any time in history, in this class order capitalist society, where there is, no repercussions to individual action, and there's a lack of organization on the part of labor and so on, and there's a lack of clarity in seeing how the global order works, how one we are and how much apart we are, because the dividedness of labor is the strength of capital. And the more divided we are, the more stronger capital it is. The more we kill ourselves, the more capital it is making money. So every liter of blood spilled is going to be a liter of money earned somewhere. And that in these formula, these pretty mechanical formula, which are the mechanics of capital, because everything has a mechanics and has a dialectics. So if we look are not wrong, they're a perception of reality, a one-sided view of reality, of what I'm saying, because they're formal. And you can, everything is really not holistic in a sense. We cannot refer to everything, but we can at least capture the dynamics of reality by looking more at the laws of reality. Because science is about uncovering the laws of development, like the law of value, the law of profit, and things like that. So, in that sense, it's not the book is not about to depress anyone. Life, the conditions of social reproductions are quite depressing. To say the least. The thing is to understand and to act upon it is the ideal that, like intellectually, organizationally, and so on. That's what makes one, content with one's life, is the fact that there is a struggle to end, whether we win or one struggles against not to win only. We might lose, but at least you take a principled stand against that order. It doesn't matter how things come out. But the idea, it's not a psychological thing. These are real facts, and that's how things are. As to the way, the organizational side, and Daniel's point on how because without organization, I think nothing is going to happen. I mean, you can have a million professors who say I'm a Marxist, but if you don't have a solid Marxist party, or a party, don't call it Marxism, but call it anything that says I want to target the private property relation, and the private property relation is the capital relation. I want to target that, call it whatever. It's not about dogma, or it's not theism of sorts. And the point is that without this, these efforts and these convictions, reasoned convictions, being mediated through an organizational whole that devolves into a weight that counters the weight of history, because what we're countering is really literally the weight of history. You can't say, I think Lenin says when, after the revolution, he encountered so many difficulties, and he says, look, we're coming up against habits and traditions and ideological capacities and apparatuses that they own, that it is very difficult to deal with. The weight of history is the weight of guns and the weight of ideology, and the guns first as well. They have guns, and they're ruthless. The minute one must think that the minute, for instance, somebody in the West becomes effective in basically denouncing and curtailing the effort. If you look at the 30s and the concentration camps of labor in the United States, and the sacrifices that were made by these people, and if you look at how many people were killed, the capital uses a mafiosi, a criminal, a genocidal tactic all the time to debunk and debauch and the organization of labor. So it is, but at the same time, there is this question to do with the very existence of each of us now. There is the fact that the crisis is is so deep at this moment, and the environmental and social crisis, and especially people, if they're not seeing the social crisis, they're seeing the environmental crisis. People are noticing that there are snow caps that are melting, that there are temperatures that we haven't, and so on. So in the past, it took a physicist from the Royal Society to say, look, people saw meteorites falling from the sky, but only when a physicist from the Royal Society said, I saw a meteorite. So the authority of science was, then it came. Nowadays, with the fact that there are news and information is disseminated on a global scale, what we have is a situation where we no longer need the authority of the royal scientist to corroborate the point that there is something that is deadly that's going to affect us all, and so it is no longer just I want more healthcare. It is also, I think my children will not have the same, and these people are smart. They have both sides to them, but let's say now well, they live and experience the disaster, and so the reason conviction individual level are looking for ways to be channeled in an organizational structure, in an organizational apparatus that is going to say, enough is enough, and it's very difficult because of the environmental undercurrent that there is going to be massive destruction on a global scale, even for many capitalists to basically deny that. And so it is this existentialist sort of condition that is now bearing upon the facts so the emphasis on the destruction of nature is itself quite an impetus, but it should be not the destruction of nature as a necessity, but as a choice, because as capital shifts the cost of production to society, it makes more money, and it shifts the cost of production to society when it kills society. So it has an interest in making pollution and more deaths. And so capital is it is rewired intrinsically to destroy nature and man. And so when this reality dawns upon people everywhere, that, profits are made by the fact that society dies and nature dies, then that's a simple fact, really. And we know this occurs all over the social reproduction time, because one has to leave the times and the books that capital imposes upon the mind. The GDP, quarterly GDP, and the quarterly profits, and so on, and because it wants to control time and space altogether. And so, when we look at real time, the time of life, the time of people, and so on, and we look at children now not having the job security, the healthcare, and also the pollution to go with, and so on, all of these things are becoming a condition of existence across the board, across the globe, that we didn't experience before. And so when we, I think, pinpoint to the destruction of nature as intrinsic to capital, we might have, first of all, a point in going. Now, there is always, one cannot predict, as I said, social consciousness and the linking of thinking to organizing and the thinking to practice is not easy. No one has an answer to that. Philosophy, since the dawn of history, is about this, and social science is about this. But at least we know from previous times that when people organize and take things seriously and know the cause of the problem and organize against it, and maybe with consciousness alone, capital will be denudated will lay bare before us, and we will be, and it will be ridiculed and shamed for the damage it has done so far. So we might not have to resort to guns. We just the fact that as an élan d'esprit who's going to speak to everybody at one moment, one can dream about this, as Eloire would say, and we wake up and people realize that this is all a sham. This is all a charade that covers up a great crime, and so on.
Of core capitalist countries. We are seeing it very clearly in the US, but we're also seeing this, all over Western Europe. Do you think there's a potential to break, to shatter that kind of historical merger of, the Western working class to imperialism, to become to become an instrument of imperialism and of capital? Because at some level, and I don't know how much of this you see as being the result of the post World War II anti-communist settlement that said, okay, we're going to give you a bit more, we're going to give your children a better future in the core countries, while continuing the violent expropriation and value accumulation by West in the South. But that seems to be breaking down. There are now people in the West are really seeing through again. The flood metaphor for me, things are being washed away, and the real structure, the real underlying logic of the system is becoming more apparent to many people. And in fact, to me, it's not an accident that even Marxist thought is becoming more popular. There is a renewed interest in Marxism in the youth, whereas, as we're about the same generation. Being a Marxist in our time was a very lonely, and sometimes you had to camouflage your identity to just be able to continue thinking. So I'm wondering if that move is changing a little bit, your overall analysis that says, well, there's nothing to be expected from anybody in the whatever global north or imperialist core countries, because they are basically part of the death machine.
Something Torkil Lausen says, that the working class in the North should not be afraid of revolutions in the South. In fact, revolutions in the South better the conditions of the working class in the North. And there is no better time to see things like that, really. And so it's and the idea that one speaks logically of the potential, that capital is not just an idea. We know that capital knows that, okay, they're being disturbed, the MAGA. Let's give them dental insurance, or something like that, so, because many of them have no dental insurance, obviously. So capital is aware that this is the crux of this is the pivot of its strength, that it has an army that is basically an instantiation of its spirit. And that's now, when the rule of capital really weakens, that's going to break, and an intercapitalist rivalry, it might indulge with itself, massacring itself, and so on. Now, but there is no. One cannot predict how things are going to go historically, right? We have a logic of things. We have a logic of development, and the logic of development is that the laws are such that the law of profit necessitates that the North pulverizes the South, the more it pulverizes the south, the more the resources and the knowledge and everything will go to the north. And it knew that relationship since day one. I mean, that's why the minute capitalism arose, they didn't spare anybody. All their feudal systems, they immediately after winning something, they rebuilt because they needed the peasant and they needed more of the peasants. When it says multiply and fill the earth, that's because the peasant was the prime mover of production, the prime instrument of production. There was no fantastic technology. But when you have the capitalist production relations changing, when you have I want to take things to sell rather than use, when use value trumps exchange, takes over as the ruling relation over exchange value, then it doesn't people are no longer necessary and there are too many of them because of the small market that because you've restricted income so much such that and you created so much output that you have a permanent crisis of overproduction. And the permanent crisis of overproduction means that you must set factories and people aside. And you make an industry out of setting people aside. That industry is setting people aside, is culling people, it's really killing people. And so, and that's the basic industry of capital. That's how capital should be viewed as it's not a progressive stage in history. It destroyed the planet. If there was more conservation under feudalism to retain something at least, and so the death, the conditions, the historical conditions in the period, in this phase that we know as capitalism is bound by death commands life. The death commodity commands the creation of life, and so in this. In this relationship, we know the laws, but we cannot predict. We can only say that if capital's rules weakens, and that's when the revolution starts, and it weakens in the north because of this, then the inter-capitalist conflict is going to set in. You are to blame. I am, and I want a bigger share. Basically, that's going to be the case. To retain a bigger share of that we're losing, going to get. I'm going to make money on the way down, so there'll be and that's a possibility. But the important thing is not to. One does not have an organizational roadmap, but one has to at least see the picture as it is. And the picture, things as they occur, is that the world one, and in that one there is two. There is the South, which is incredibly dying at a very high rate relative to the progress of the times, and the North, which is not, which is still dying because of the natural disaster, and also because capital is auto-repressing. It's like it has a Protestant like self-flagellation, etho. So the point is that it's one does not know, but one does not oppose capital and oppose imperialism and oppose the criminal clowns because one thinks that the future is mine and I'm going to win. It doesn't matter how things turn out, one must oppose them. Because it is basically a question of, not a question of spiritual, it's a question of literally better lives for everyone, and literally you get more out of opposing them. And they need you to oppose them. The odd thing is, without opposition, they don't make any money as well. They need the opposition. The system has its seed of destruction within it because the system needs labor to say, I hate capital. It moves in the structural adjustment in history occurs as it conquers labor all the time. It makes more conquers labor all the time. And so dead labor and living labor, society living labor is this dialectic of dead and living labor is there, and so it is to our luck that the system has its seed of destruction within it because it needs opposition. But it needs effective opposition, not the sort of opposition that says, well, I want some weak country like Grenada to oppose me and then I'm going to destroy it. The United States invades Grenada. I mean, that's what the 20th century held for us. And a sort of, a milestone. And if Grenada, it invades Grenada, it gains more power over the Caribbean, more power over the globe, by demonstrating its capacity to kill over a small island nation. The very display, the very demonstration effect of its capacity to kill is itself a rejuvenation, a re-empowerment of the capital, of the power of capital in the value relation. It's a re-empowerment of the rate of exploitation on a global scale. Because the more power it displays, the more powerful it is, the more the unequal exchange and the conditions of production will be conditions of destitute and the unequal exchange conditions. So it's all there. It's all a self-reinforcing thing, and one must cut the umbilical cord of that system. One must oppose it. And it needs us to oppose it, luckily. So sometimes it pays somebody to oppose it. But not when they become effective, too effective, especially in the center. So the center is quite dangerous for them. When a revolutionary intellectual in the center acts out in a very effective way against the imperial center, it's good. It makes one, it's not depressing anymore.
Incredible, wide-ranging conversation. For the benefit of our audience, many of whom are, students and students of Marxism, we wanted to ask you if you could tell us about your own formation as a scholar. And, as I said before we pressed record, I just find your work to reflect a sort of scope and rigor that puts you in the camp of some of the great Marxist philosophers. Could you talk about who your influences are? As I also mentioned, which I'll mention again, I noticed that you put into dialogue many thinkers that usually are oppositional or posed as oppositional, which I found interesting. Like you talk about Althusser, you incorporate Mészáros, the great student of Lukács, and I would say Mészáros for you seems to be one of your most important references. Could you speak about him, if you would? But yeah, could you give us a sense of your your formation, your pedagogy, and your background here?
I mean, when it was in academia, it's very difficult for Marxists to hold positions. The only position I held with a sort of distinction was when I was awarded some grant as distinguished foreign scholar by the government of Guangdong in China. And that's the amount of money was ridiculously small. So but it's about the only time I got a grant to do anything. Because whenever I submitted a research proposal for a grant, I was never. So I basically gave up. So my line of thought and the people who grant money is. So that's but luckily I had some technical skill as a mathematical statistician and so on. So that's always. So I'm not just talk. I can run computers and a bit and used to anyways. So that always gets you a job teaching mathematical statistics and things like that. And so that's, and you can always, even in mathematical statistics, you can always introduce the labor theory of value in the discussion of this, and they'll find a way to kick you out after a while. But essentially, I mean, as a student, I was like all people in my generation. So Nikos Poulantzas was, but later, and I met Arthur Davis, who used to write for the Monthly Review, and he was a mentor and a very good teacher, and so on. And then, of course, for my doctorate, I was going to do my doctorate with Andre Gunder Frank, but he moved to Amsterdam, and I was not of. I did not have the financial wherewithal. My grant was too small to basically take residence in an expensive city. But I ended up doing all the readings and joining reading groups like everybody, and on imperialism, on Marxism, and sort of life is a learning process, and the exposure was good, and when and so I'm a bit utilitarian in the way I refer to Mijaros, and I must say I know there are shortcomings in everybody's work. I mean, when I read what I wrote, I kind of find myself silly, and because I find and so, but it's this utilitarianism that's probably, but it fits into a line of thought that I want to develop. I know where the shortcomings are. I don't want to ridicule or humiliate people of such stature in thought, because we all borrow. Like Luzurdo says, in Western Marxism, you have a broad range of things to draw from, because they're the only ones with the leisure and the capabilities to produce research. And, I mean, I look at the universities here, and they teach 6 courses every term, and they have like 1,000 students each, and it's impossible to do any research in such environments. And if you do any research that's going to bother the state, you're likely going to be fired immediately. Or if fired is the smaller side of things, they usually imprison probably or something like that, intellectuals. So the production of knowledge and the means of production of knowledge are found in the North. And we say Western Marxism, but not all of the Marxism of the West is polluted and complicit with imperialism. I mean, if you think about, for instance, the Monthly Review's output historically, it's a landmark for the development of Marxist thought on a global scale, and so we cannot say Western Marxism is only related to the ones who say bomb a poor country to get rid of its dictator, or there is I mean, the dictatorship of the North is far more and criminal than anything that is found in the developing world. It's because there is such a single-mindedness. They are going to elect abroad. That's pretty sickening, really. But it is that sort of, and so there is. I know shortcomings, and in what I'm reading and so forth. But I don't think because there's something of use, something of use insofar as as the weight of structures, because his history is like a huge structural rock that we must, as a sort of Sisyphus, move around, and so. So in that sense, Althusser is when he defines things in that sense, and so there is something there to be seen, and when and so there is that I must say a bit of opportunism on my part, when reading these guys and using them. But it's good opportunism. Like there is right-wing opportunism and left-wing opportunism. It's the left-wing intellectual opportunism, I think. Yes. But it's very, but I mean, you can't, without the West and the production of knowledge in the West, there is not social knowledge, and a lot of it is very radical. Reality is radical, and some of the thought that comes out of the West is very radical, and that's good.
Appreciated your point regarding, in your book on psychoanalysis, you said that a lot of psychoanalytic theory tries to put forward an account for the eradication of class struggle as a consistent social reality. And so, if you are a Marxist and you absorb that particular point of view, you have kneecapped half of what makes Marxism. So I think there's some question that would be interesting to ask regarding how you remain in fidelity to a kind of vision of a Marxist vision. Perhaps the answer to that is evidenced just by the fact that you have such a profound mastery of capital as a text itself. And I very much appreciate your critique of empiricism. And and then I'll turn it to Benji, but I wanted to maybe invite you to say something about the critique of empiricism. You identify this within David Harvey, for example, and you often talk about these various laws that Marx develops in Capital, such as primitive accumulation, the law of profit, etc. And this is very interesting to me as somebody that studies both Marxism but also philosophy, because empiricism and pragmatism have a long history, I think, of a very ugly tendency to compromise Marxist practice. Could you say something about the problem of empiricism in general? And then we'll go to...
Yes, I mean, it's always, the problem is the partial truth. Partial truth is a falsity. And empiricism is about a partial truth. It doesn't say the wrong things all the time. Sometimes you can concoct anything, you can fabricate the truth from the data or from even an observation which is half cut, and it's detached from the whole and the relationship to the whole. So the interrelatedness that dialectics provide is missing in empiricism. And for instance, if you take Harvey and the spatial fix, and the spatial fix. We know as political economists. He's a geographer, so he has this idea of space, which is intrinsic seminal to his thought. But as political scientist and political economist, you see that the fact that even if you build if you put so much sunk costs in a place, and you erect buildings and factories and so on, for capital, it wouldn't matter much if it completely bulldozes, if it levels this to the ground with one bomb, because the essential thing for capital is the power of capital, and as Pizarro's always mentions, and others, and Lenin and so forth, the power, the primacy of politics. It is a capital relationship that must remain in power. Money, power, and it's smart. It doesn't reason, reflexively. I have a building there, I shouldn't destroy. It doesn't reason like that. It reasons that I'm going to be weak if that building stays there. So I'm going to take it down probably, and most likely it will take it down. And so capital is resilient because it has this logic of the primacy of politics that I want. It doesn't matter whether it's America or any other place in the world that is going to be at the helm of social relations, and this, as Bettelheim says, pyramidal order structured in dominance, the totality of capital. If you have that case, then then you know that it doesn't matter whether you call them Americans or Martians or Indonesians or whatever, they're going to do the same thing. You know, they're going to have to keep capital happy, capital in power. And that's this sort of point of projecting also this, you know, making a subject out of a thing is really the big fault. I mean, you know, apart from the fact that it's partial truth, it makes a subject out of a thing. And then we have too many buildings, and the buildings are going to dictate to us what to do. But the buildings are not only buildings; they're social relations, and there's social relations. The social relations of capital. They're derivatives. They're derived. They're secondary and tertiary relations of capital, and they're going to say, look, if capital is going to become weak, please take us out. Even the things are going to speak in the vernacular of people, and so that's the problem with empiricism and other problems as well. And it's not seeing the interrelatedness. That the fact once you put interrelatedness in scope, then you have a better systems scope of things. And then, you know, a better system scope says the world is a single totality, and that world is structured in dominance, and that dominance has a structure in the north and has political structure, and it wants to maintain power, and that power is basically maintained by the power of the gun. Uh, and so that's the point, really, I think.
I think we'll close shortly, but what you're talking about, this logic of totality, is at the heart of our tradition, the socialist tradition. I mean, for all of his problems, there's an English philosopher, Mark Fisher, who had this very interesting idea, riffing off of Frederick Jameson, that we live in a time of what he called capitalist realism, which basically refers to the collapse in our culture to index or even think totality. Seems to me that that's very true, that there has been a decline in this capacity. So when one encounters a thinker like yourself, I'm very refreshed, because you're always bringing us back to the question of totality. Benji, please jump in.
Yeah, I think that's on kind of the same point. You know, you really bring back the totalizing analysis, but it's a totalizing analysis because we are analyzing a totalizing phenomenon, a totalizing. Sometimes I think of it as a artificial intelligence that has taken over the world and means to turn everything into dead commodities. And I think that's super important. And also in the way you present your analysis, there's always, you know, the material conditions, but also the ideological side. It's always a totality in that sense also. And so it also affects our psyches, our individual and our collective identities. And I think you go beyond, well, I have some, like, you know, this idea in Marx, in Lenin, that ideas are purely a reflection of the world, but I think it not just purely a reflection of the process of value extraction by waste, but also it's done through maybe specific psychological mechanisms that capital, as the subject of history, uses to actually lay waste to our psyche. So I don't know if I'm, you know, overreading your book, but I see this when you talk about social nature, when you talk about the epistemologies, when you talk about ways of being in the world that are different. And I'm a clinical psychologist by trade and by training, and the way imperialism works psychologically is there are very close parallels to, you know, what we call narcissistic group or family dynamics. And it's very interesting because everything is veiled, everything is a lie, every single reality is painted as the opposite of what it is. And in the same way, like your totalizing analysis is an analysis of the totalitarian nature of imperialist capitalism, where actually imperialist capitalism accused communism of being this totalitarian beast. And you see the same process all the time. You see it almost chemically pure in the present acceleration of Zionist exterminating genocide, where every accusation is a confession. I've even coined a term, I call it accufession. And so they are literally, in a strange way, projecting everything they are doing onto their victims. And these kinds of systems, on the clinical psychology side of things, they tend to stay up until they crumble in one go. And there are many people that are involved in the system but aren't really running it, that kind of see it doesn't make sense, but they never want to be the first one out of it because the costs are too high. And I think we're almost seeing something similar in terms of international relations. And we're also seeing something similar. You mentioned how countries can't really move out of it, otherwise they will, crash your currency, and then you will lose whatever popular support you have. And I think the way out of this, and I think I read it in your book, is going back to this radical equality of human worth, as opposed to the supremacist identities that emerge and maintain exploitation. And I think that is super important. And it also, going back to this general idea of building a new revolutionary worldwide class consciousness, it has to be built, I believe, on this radical equality of worth, for which we're still in the psychology. I'm kind of working on it. And it's also the way, interestingly, in terms of clinical psychology, sorry for going back to my line of work, it's also the way you get people out of those systems. You help them contact that space within themselves where they can see themselves as just as worthy as anyone else. So once you're just as worthy as anyone else, you are just as worthy of self-determination, of being your own way in the world. And I love that in your work, because you don't go, everybody must adopt, the eternal principles of Marxism, Leninism, or whatever. And one final point on this is, I think this is what's going on in China. Once you become sovereign in some ways, then you kind of rebuild social nature. Like, the Chinese people are proud of what they've achieved, and they're not so, vulnerable to imperialist propaganda, because they can see that they have achieved that kind of radical equality of being, which they actually put out outside in the world. We do it our way. We're not going to pretend you should do it our way, but you should do it your way with whatever, national characteristics you have. So big question, but on the psychological side of things, there's a lot that is very tantalizing in your work, and I would love to discuss it more, but maybe for another day.
I to mind that once as a student activist, I invited the winner of the Che Guevara Prize from Cuba to speak at the university I was at, and he says, the point is that the island is small, it's under embargo, and how could it sustain itself? How is it capable? And he says something that that Guevara says. Guevara has writings in these issues, on these issues, and he says, we let people protect the achievements of socialism. Let the people protect their achievements. In China too, there is, for instance, within 10 years, real wages rose threefold, 3 times. And so when, that, I just, and the party cadre is 1 out of 14 people, I think, in China, or 1 out of 15 people belongs to the party. So every family has a party member. So basically it's a people's party. It's not like a minute group, it's representative of every family. So every family in China that has seen its wage rise from 1 to 3, from 1,000 to 3,000 a month or something like that, is going to protect that. So that's why they are proud and they see the achievements of the development of we led the productive force, we freed the value theory, we paid a very high cost in order to obtain the technology that's going to protect us from this monstrous Western hemisphere that accumulates by genocide. And now we are reinvesting in people. It was a cost. So this idea of handling a transition of sort, because going from Maoism, which was a great period that laid the groundwork for development, and it has a growth rate of 8% as well, yearly average of 8% as well. And going to the post-Maoist period in order to basically internalize and repatriate technology and so on, because they needed that. Without technology, you don't have national defense, and without national defense, you are subject to eradication. And so they knew that, they knew the enemy, and so they've built them. They decided to free the value relation. They knew that they're going to pay a price in pollution and dislocation, but then they had the sovereignty and they retained the popular sovereignty to basically reinvest and re-clean and redo the environment. And some cities are very clean now in China. Most cities are clean in China. So people are going to protect that. So there are the examples, the examples of when we have socialism, and even when we have socialism, what traits of socialism we have in the Western Hemisphere. The welfare state is, it's not really socialist, but it's based on the imperial rents. But it delivers. Technically, it delivers. It makes people healthier. It makes people better, and so on. So socialism, we know that socialism works, and from whatever experiment, but we cannot let it work, because if people get more and live longer, we'll make less profits. So there is the profit wage contradiction is there, unfortunately, and it involves killing people, and so. I'm not. I've read the psychology of the working class and so forth, and I used to read, and I don't remember much of it. Like Reich, on his text, his early texts were okay. So, what strikes me is this glorification, this concocted national history and identity history is always fabricated. Any history is fabricated, relative to whoever pays the piper. But the point is, there's a glorification. People don't realize that across the planet, there's a glorification of slavery. These are all class societies. There's nothing to be glorified there in the history of humanity. Nothing, not this great guy or that great conqueror. These are all slave owners and slave drivers. How can you? And literally, the very system that had these slaves cannot function without slavery. We're not functioning without slavery. We have, at least a slave in feudal times was worthwhile. We needed him to live as long as possible because he served as long as possible. But the extinguishing of the life of the wage slave these days is the source of profit. So we live in a much more monstrous system that is so monstrous, and yet the psychology of it, the power to introject, that people introject and internalize the idea that there is no alternative, as Mijaros would always say, that there is no alternative. The encasing of the mind Mijaros says, if somebody tells me there is no alternative as a student, I'd fail him, because whenever you have time, in real time, the alternatives are there all the time. And like I said, they always give you this wagon that's going to kill 5 people on the side, or what do you do? That's sort of hilarious. It's an insult to intelligence, to to draw ethics on this basis without real time. That's the American pragmatist. So you have when you have those, and that's, sadly, I don't want to run along because we've been going on for nearly 2 hours, I think. But sadly, the psychological elements that are drowning people in these symbols of power that capital has created, they've become bars of prisons that bar people from looking outside of that system. So they live in a cultural prison that's been created by capital, and that's like well, I read a first year psychology book on acute schizophrenia, and one case was that a person is so acutely depressed that his eyesight can only see a part of the picture and not the whole picture in some case studies. And so that sort of acute schizophrenia is a class symptom. People see just one side, see the foot rather than the whole body. And that's acute. That's the most acute, and what I've read is that's the most, I'm not a psychologist, but what I've read is that, that's the most acute case of schizophrenia, because they become livid and they don't move. And so, and if you think about it, then the masses across the world are forms of capital. They've internalized the norms and the ethics of capital, and they think outside of time. The biggest mistake is to take time out of the picture, to take history out of the picture. Nobody is not a product of time and history. There is space, but there is also time, and time and space are, probably inseparable. They are the transcendental categories, and so you've taken the transcendental categories which are born with us, out of us. That's how strong capital is. It distorted. It made and I think I'm thinking loud now. It created mass global schizophrenia, and that's difficult. How is this going? How are we going to treat this? Through the correct practice targeting with all means possible the principal contradiction. And the principal contradiction, we all know, it's a south-north, north-south. Thank you. 2 hours.
I very much appreciate your sort of riffing and reflections on the psychological. Benji and I have an ongoing debate regarding that. I tell my friends that in psychoanalytic world that at some point you have to decide between Marx and Freud. It's not like a unity.
Easy choice to make.
You have to make a choice. Because I think you're right. In your book, you say a lot of these people say, yes, well, Freud teaches us that class struggle is some biological death drive, and therefore it's forget about it. And that's real, and that's a problem. That's a real problem. But that's for another time.
Actually, if I may just interject, I think what Ali's work shows is that it's the opposite of a death drive. Class struggle on the part of labor is a life drive. And this is what I find really inspiring and optimistic in your work.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kadri. We'll close. Thank you, comrades, for your time and attention. Any final comments, please?
Well, thank you for the invitation. It's really the questions were quite spot on, so to speak. They hit all the corners that probably needed more elaboration in my work. So next time, I hope. But I'm too lazy now, so too lazy. All right. Cheers.
But just to tell us why laziness is important in your book, to regain some time and not let it be abstracted from us. So thank you so much, and please be lazy for a while.
Okay, thank you, comrades. Until next time, everyone, all the
Bye-bye.
best.
Bye-bye.